Hello, and welcome to Conversations with Matt DeLockery. Today, we're going to start getting into the science by looking at the third reason to think that the universe began to exist. Specifically, we're going to look at something called the second law of thermodynamics. But don't worry, you don't need to have a degree in physics to understand what we're going to talk about. I promise there won't be any equations. We're only going to talk about general principles. Really simply, the second law of thermodynamics says that things basically break down and fall apart over time. A real shocker, I know. What it actually is a measure of something called entropy and a whole bunch of statistics. But there's a really easy way to explain it that will be both true to what the law means as well as give you a visual image for what's going on, and involves no big words and no math. So, let's get going. Imagine you take a glass mixing bowl and fill it with water. Then, in the left side of the bowl, you put in some yellow food coloring. And in the right side of the bowl, you put in some blue food coloring. For a little while, the yellow food coloring will stay on the left side and the blue will stay on the right side. But if you wait long enough, they will eventually mix, and you'll have a consistent green color throughout the whole bowl. Both the yellow and blue colors will become evenly distributed throughout the bowl so that they will end up green. The second law of thermodynamics basically says that this is what you should expect. The yellow will not stay on the one side, and the blue will not stay on the other. And once the two become mixed, they are not going to become unmixed. They're not going to separate back out into yellow and blue. Now, it's technically possible that this could happen, but statistically, it is very improbable. And the way the math works, it is more improbable the larger the system in question is. So, if you had a very tiny bowl with just a few molecules of water and a single molecule of each of yellow and blue food coloring, it could probably happen. With a normal-sized bowl like the one we're just talking about, you can just forget about it happening. If we were to make a bowl the size of the entire universe, the odds of the two colors separating would be so small that to call the chance of that happening astronomically improbable would be very generous. And that's really what we need to talk about, a bowl the size of the universe. Because that's what we're talking about, the universe. So, as we already know, given enough time, everything will eventually break down. Food, cars, and even plastic bags will eventually break down, though some things take longer than others. Even things as big as the planets, stars, and galaxies themselves will break down. And as they break down, they will become distributed throughout the universe. Right now, they are sort of like the food coloring that's all bunched up in one place. But with enough time, everything will break down completely and become evenly distributed throughout the universe. Basically, it will be that green mixture of food coloring that you saw in the glass mixing bowl. Everything in the universe will disintegrate into an even, featureless soup. Now, the question we need to ask is related to the age of the universe. If the universe is infinitely old, why don't we see this soup now? Why don't we look out at the universe with our telescopes and see, well, nothing? No stars, no planets, no galaxies, nothing. Or at least, nothing interesting. Just an even distribution of everything that once was a star or a galaxy or even us. And that brings up an interesting question. Why are we still here? How can you be listening to me right now? Think about it. If the universe is infinitely old, nothing should still be around, right? If everything breaks down with enough time, and there were an infinite amount of time before now, then everything should have already broken down. Since it isn't broken down, then that means that the universe is not infinitely old. And since the universe is not infinitely old, it must be finite in age. And that, of course, means it had a beginning. Okay, well, we're done now. Well, not really. Because as you probably expected, there's an objection. So, let's talk about the objection. All right, well, because all of the stuff about the universe breaking down is based on statistics, there's always a possibility, no matter how small, that everything could do just the opposite of what you would expect. In other words, there's a very small possibility that the green would actually separate back into blue and yellow. However, because this probability is so small, if the super unlikely were to occur at all, what would probably happen is that it would occur in a small pocket somewhere. In our bowl example, rather than all the green separating back into blue and yellow, it's far more likely that if it occurred at all, it would be in some small corner somewhere, and just for a little while. You know, some tiny little space over on one side of the bowl that has a few molecules that separate back out into blue and yellow. In the universe, it'd be much the same. The whole universe wouldn't go back to stars, planets, galaxies, plastic bags, and so forth. It would just be one small corner. And it's much more likely that there would be one small corner that came back from the even featureless soup that we described than the whole universe coming back. But just think about that for a minute, and then think about how huge our universe is. I'll put a link to a video in the description that will help put this in perspective. Most of us don't realize just how big the universe really is. Because of this, if this statistical improbability were ever to happen, it would be much more likely that a small region were to exist than the entire universe coming back to, well, the universe that we see now. So let's imagine 3 different scenarios, each of which is more likely to occur than the last. The first one we already talked about, and that would be the entire universe coming back from the featureless soup that we described. This is like the entire bowl reversing directions and changing from a pale green color and separating back out into distinct blue and yellow regions on opposite sides of the bowl. If you think this is unlikely for the bowl, then watch the video I linked to and consider how unlikely it would be for a bowl the size of the entire universe to do this. The second scenario would be the same as the first one, only a small region, say the size of our solar system coming back from the soup. This is like the bowl staying green, but some small corners separating back into blue and yellow. This is way more likely to occur than the entire universe being unbroken down. The third scenario is a little weird, but it's much more likely than either of the other two. The most likely option is that a single brain has come into existence by chance and is imagining everything. I know, I told you it was weird, but this will help prove a point, so please bear with me. On this view, you and I are nothing but imaginations or dreams that exist in that brain. That brain would be imagining you, me, and the entire universe. So there would be the perception that all the external world existed, but it wouldn't really be there. We would believe that the whole universe was there, but that's only because the brain was dreaming you and I believe that. In reality, the universe is still the featureless soup, but in one tiny minuscule little corner, a brain has come back into existence. It has been unbroken down, if you will, and it is imagining that the universe is separated into blue and yellow, even though it's really not. Statistically, this is far and away the most likely option. So, if you think that something could come back from the soup, if you think that the green could separate back into blue and yellow, then the most rational thing for you to believe is actually number 3, that we're all imaginations or dreams of a single brain. On that view, the universe, as we know it, doesn't exist. It's actually just a broken down, featureless soup, a remnant of what once was a beautiful universe. That is, except for one brain, which is imagining all of this, and neither you nor I exist. But if you don't believe this, if you think this sounds a little ridiculous, which it does, then you should probably think that this statistical near impossibility has not actually happened. For the entire universe that we see to actually come back from this even featureless soup when everything's broken down, and for all the green to separate back into blue and yellow, 2 things would be required. First, the nearly impossible must have happened and something actually did come back from the soup. Something must have become unbroken down, even though everything always breaks down. At a minimum, this must have been a brain imagining everything that we think of as reality. But really, if we believe that we and everything that we experience is real, it must have been more than this. And second, if the world around us is real, what came out of the soup would have been an enormous universe with a lot of complexity instead of a much smaller region. Basically, the bowl we have been talking about has to be the size of the entire universe. Again, watch the video. And it has to separate back into blue and yellow. Except in reality, the universe is much more interesting than food color separating, so it's even more complex than that. So, based on the second law of thermodynamics, you can do one of 2 things. You can either believe the next to impossible happened, twice, or you can believe that the universe had a beginning and is not infinitely old. If we're going to be rational about this, the second one is a lot more likely. But that, of course, means that the universe began to exist.